So as mentioned, this is a bit of a preview of our last slide, which is sort of here the action plans that we have, the 4 items, but we're highlighting the first one here. We want to get input on how should we get input, so to some extent. What's going to be the best way for us to engage with our communities? What's going to be the best way to make sure that we have people who are get everyone involved, get the input of folks as we're framing up the future of CBREs for what we're doing. And when we call it survey here, it's really meant to be the verb, not the noun, to borrow from my friend Ryan. It's, how do we get input? And it's not necessarily meant to be literally a survey like, is it A, B, or C? How are we going to gather, build the process to encourage and get meaningful input from our communities? So that's something that we're going to be working on quite a bit, and you guys will have the opportunity here on the next slide to provide some input on and some thoughts on how specifically we might do some of that. Before we move on to the next slide, there is an actual survey that is going on as well. I just wanted to highlight that that is coming out shortly, I believe in July, and it's called the Oregon Clean Energy Survey, and it's a formal survey conducted by a third party. And it's a follow-on to a survey we did in 2022 that was focused on for Oregon customers and Oregon stakeholders, actually all stakeholders, gathering really broad perspectives around the transition to a cleaner energy future. And it was commissioned as part of the distribution system planning project, and that happened kind of prior to the clean energy plan, what we're working on now, coming through. And luckily, and very, very fortuitously, a lot of the approach we took in that DSP focused survey is great foundation for continued exploration that we're going to use in the clean energy plan. So that is an actual survey coming out. Now back to our pre-scheduled planning or our pre-scheduled discussion, which is talking about the softer survey. How do we get meaningful input from communities around CBREs? Tag, we can go on to the next one. So from that standpoint, we are trying some new things here. We are asking for feedback from folks, and in terms of the channels that we're looking for input, we have a handful of questions that are available on this survey. You can actually literally, while it's on the screen, you can pull up the QR code and go to the form and see it. But the idea here is getting input from stakeholders here on how, getting suggestions. How can we more effectively assess community interest in CBRE projects over time? How can we increase our community's input from all communities? So this is a set of questions that we've started off with here. And just so you know, also, as mentioned, we have this channel of input, which is the community, the Clean Energy Plan engagement series, which is sort of broadly open to kind of all comers in Oregon. It's focused on being a place where you'll get technical knowledge as well as sort of background and information really broadly about what's happening with the Clean Energy Plan. There are 2 parallel channels that are focused on kind of more specific communities or areas. One is the Community Benefit Impact Advisory Group, and that is really focused. It's a statewide group made up of representatives from organizations, mostly community-based organizations, and those would be folks that represent the communities more directly, but aren't folks who usually would participate in a community in a utility planning process. So the goal of that group is really to solicit input for equity and for how do we assess or how do we engage with communities a little bit more. So these same questions will be going to the CBIAG as well. We'll be kind of gathering their input on how do we best engage. And then the final one is a tribal nations engagement series, which is focused on working with the tribal nations within the Oregon service, actually, I think within the Northwest. So this is our first attempt at that. First attempt at getting input specifically about CBREs. how can we ensure that we're getting input from the communities? What kind of tips and tricks do you have on numbers 3 and 4 around specific tools, specific approaches you've seen? And if you don't feel like doing the survey now, which is fine, you don't have to. This will be included in the published deck that goes out, and it will also go, I believe, in the follow-up notes so that you can access it from there. But we expect to have the form. If we can get input by July 10th, that will give us some time to compile that information and help us put together materials and refine our approach going forward. So thanks in advance for taking time to do the survey. Any questions on the survey as a whole? All right. Final slide here. This is sort of just a recap of what we have for our action plans really over the next through the end of this year are our major intents. The first one we covered a little bit, which is continuing the assessment of needs and opportunities. The end goal of that is so that we can inform the CBRE potential study and understand things better. But really, it's also focusing our efforts now on the things that we're going to be working on over the next year here, and then that engagement of making sure that we're actively engaging and improving our approach to engaging along the way and getting real input from the communities on what makes sense here. There's a lot to figure out here, and I think we acknowledge that and we recognize it, and we hope that we can go through meaningful conversations to improve what we're gonna put together in the end. The second piece is the straw proposal around the expansion of the community resilience battery storage project, which we talked about 2 slides before, which is the green, the as is and the to be. So that will be a major focus for us and a topic for us in the next August section of this engagement channel for the Clean Energy Plan engagement. Again, number 3, continuing to explore and leverage public funding, just making sure we're keeping that top of mind and know that we are indeed pursuing those. And then the final is to build tools and awareness to assist communities and stakeholders in connecting into CBREs. So as we're defining kind of how CBREs fit in the Clean Energy Plan environment going forward, helping to pull together useful information, look at the process by which people engage in this, look at the process by which they move through from planning into potential implementation, and providing tools and information that might help them get through that. And that's all we have right now on CBREs. We have a lot to work with yourselves as well as the other engagement channels. So we're looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And thanks everybody for your questions, and hopefully you'll take that survey and provide more feedback. Any parting questions for John? So Micah has a question, John.
Yeah, hi Micah. Sorry, I'll come back on 1 sec. The process documented in any planning materials in terms of leveraging public funding. There, as I mentioned, we're pursuing Pacific Core as a whole is pursuing some really large level funding, and the pieces of that would come through, depending on kind of what we end up being granted, would come through more likely like it's not going to be like a 1-for-1. We're not going to go pursue funding right this second to go do something in Coos Bay right now. We're pursuing opportunities to do major resilience upgrades across the West. So that's sort of where we are in that planning. So we don't have a lot of details and planning materials at this time. We're very early in the grant process. So a lot of it is waiting to see, with fingers crossed, and continuing to just make sure we're hitting every deadline on submitting information and details as we get into that. So so it's not documented as of yet because it's still very much in process. Hope that answers your question, Micah. Sorry, I wish I had a more definitive answer for you.
All right, thank you for that. Tag, next section. So we have Tom Burns, Vice President of Resource Planning and Acquisitions, to talk about resource procurement. Tom?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I will try and be as short and succinct as possible because I recognize that this is a beautiful Friday afternoon. I would encourage everyone to ask questions as they occur to them. I very much appreciate a dialogue and exchange while I'm talking about things. I hate just kind of giving a speech. It doesn't feel very collaborative, so to speak. So I have the IRP team and the commercial strategy team. The commercial strategy team also, that translates over to procurement. And we're going to start first, though, with taking a look at the IRP work that has been done and some of the recommendations that they have made over the last few years. So far, from a system-wide basis, we are looking at approximately 9,000 megawatts of new wind generation, 7,000 megawatts of solar, 1,000 megawatts of transmission, and 500 megawatts of advanced nuclear is currently selected. Now, that's all fine and dandy, and that's all necessary to bring about decarbonization to our entire system. But specifically, what we're here to talk about today is small scale renewables, resources that are less than 20 megawatts or less. These resources are specific to Oregon, and it's a requirement as a result of House Bill 2021. So our target specifically is that 10% of resources allocated to Oregon are going to be small scale renewables. Now, that sounds like a great big number, but in reality, what it boils down to is 10% of all the resources allocated to Oregon have to be small scale renewables. That's approximately 490 megawatts of incremental resources that we have to go out and get. So existing small scale renewable resources are the equivalent of about 4.5% of the requirement. So we have to go out and get an additional 5.5%. Now, this probably will not be the first time that we have to issue a small scale renewable RFP, request for proposals, because as load grows in Oregon, as more and more resources get allocated to Oregon, we're going to have to step up that percentage of small scale renewables. And one thing that's missing from this that I want to make sure that I mention is the fact that 2030 is the date that we have to have all these small scale renewables in service as a result of House Bill 2021. Tag, could you jump to the next slide, please? So currently, we have an open all source RFP, request for proposals. My apologies, I will use acronyms way too much. So please stop me and ask me to explain what the acronyms are. So request for proposals, RFP. We have an open one right now. Small scale renewables were invited to be bidders as part of that all source RFP. We actually had no bidders present for the 2022 all source RFP. As a result of our aggressive decarbonization, we anticipate that we're going to have to issue another RFP, a 2023 all source RFP. Exactly how that's going to end up taking place, it could be 2022 all source RFP part 2. So we're not exactly sure what the name is going to be, but it's going to be another all source RFP that we're going to be issuing. Now, concurrent to that, we're also going to be issuing a small scale RFP because we absolutely have to procure these resources by 2030. And that becomes critical. It'll especially become obvious when we look at our timelines in the subsequent slides. But we anticipate that from the time we issue an RFP to the time that these resources actually go in service, it's going to be approximately 5 years. And that's if everything goes well. You know, that's putting us very close to our compliance deadline, because if we get all these resources in place by January 1st, 2029, that doesn't leave us much room for any error if any of these resources fall out, happen to stop development. You know, let's say that a developer goes bankrupt and all of a sudden we're missing one of the projects. So we have to have a very good handle on exactly what's going to be arriving on our system by 2029. So,
Hey, Tom,
yes, yes,
you got a question from Joshua.
perfect.
So can you talk about QFs as small scale resources? Are they included in the small scale RFP, and do they count towards the 10% requirement?
So QFs less than 20 megawatts do count towards the requirement. That is the case. Generally speaking, QFs do not. There's special negotiated pricing already in place for QFs, so there generally is not a need for them to participate in an RFP process. Joshua, does that answer your question? And I apologize.
Thanks.
My apologies. The dialog box on my screen is underneath another dialog box, so I can't see that. So thank you.
Oh, no worries. That's what we're here for.
Perfect. Tag, next slide. Okay. Actually, I went too far ahead. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. So a couple of things that that I want to touch upon before we dive into this proposed schedule that I have here. So we've never had a small scale specific RFP. There generally are not any set rules. There's no prescribed process for the issuance of a small scale RFP. So this is where we're seeking your input, because this is the first one ever, and we're kind of, you know, I hate to use the word making it up as we go along, but we are creating the process as we go along. So there already is very specific processes associated with utility scale RFPs. Utility scale RFPs being resources greater than 80 megawatts. And we're going to use that utility scale RFP as a guideline, as a blueprint for what we're proposing as far as a timeline and rules for a small scale RFP. And before I get too much started into the timeline, you know, I want to point out something that's absolutely crucial, and that is the need for all resources to have a studied interconnection with transmission services as part of the cluster study process. Now, that cluster study process, the next one is May 16th, 2024. And that is the last cluster study submission date in order to participate in the upcoming small scale renewable RFP. And there's going to be more to follow on that. But part of what our consideration is for the timeline of the small scale RFP is we want to make sure that everybody's aware of that cluster study process, that requirement to, have a submission to transmission operations, Pacific Corp transmission operations, let them study the interconnection. And then from there, we can consider those bids in the RFP process. So real quick, just diving into the timeline. So with a traditional utility scale RFP, we would open a docket. We would notify the market. There's a relatively extended duration associated with that because the duration isn't there for the small scale renewables. We're anticipating, and these are proposed dates, the end of September of 23 to notify the market about that small scale RFP. There's a independent evaluator that is required as a part of utility scale RFPs. We're proposing that we use a independent evaluator for the small scale renewable RFPs. We're proposing to use the same one that we do currently for the all source RFP, and that will streamline the process considerably. We would file the final RFP document on November 25th of 23. It's primarily informational. Much of the public comment we're anticipating that we're going to address in the CEP engagement series, as well as any other community outreach that we do. So it just so happens November 26th, we would be issuing the RFP to the marketplace. I happen to not be able to forget that date because it's also my mother's birthday. Not that that matters to anybody else but me, but it keeps it at the forefront of my mind. And then the next important date, as I mentioned before, May 16th, the cluster study window closes. And right now, we do not have enough resources submitted into the cluster study process to even get to compliance. So I just kind of want to put that out there. We're going to be doing everything we can to make sure there's as many participants in this small scale renewable RFP, but it is dependent that they submit into the cluster study process. So cluster study results, pardon me, back, the early part of November 24, from there, bids can be submitted. And we anticipate having bid evaluation complete, late 2025, or excuse me, late in the first quarter of 2025. Filing our shortlist with the Oregon Commission so we can actually engage upon procurement with these resources. And we anticipate being finished with contract negotiations sometime in April of 2025. And then it leaves approximately 3.5 years for completion of the build of the resources so they can hit their commercial operation dates by January 1st, 2029.
Hey, Tom.
Yep.
Another question for you from Elise. What
Sure.
happens to bids if the cluster study requirements aren't reached? Will study be done individually, or I guess not bids, but the RFPs that were submitted?
Okay, I'm trying to understand the question. I think there might have been a little bit lost in translation.
I think the core question is what happens to bids if the cluster study requirements aren't reached?
Then they will be studied independently.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions before we move to the next slide? Tag, next slide. So I actually appreciate this view because it kind of contrasts the difference between the utility scale RFP as well as the proposed small scale RFP, because it really shows how we can save a couple of days in another place and really give the place, give extended time in areas where we think that it might be needed most. Um, but once again, we're soliciting feedback. So please, if we've got this wrong, let us know. So the IE hiring process, very condensed, utilizing the same IE that the Oregon Commission has already approved, and they were happy with them. It seems that the Oregon Commission is happy with them. So we'd like to continue on with that relationship and really streamline this process. 14 days as opposed to 64 days. The regulatory approval process, from what we're looking at, because it's not subject to the competitive bidding rules, we can move through this process pretty quickly in about 42 days. So RFP issuance, that's where we want to make sure that as many people see this, participate in it, are able to participate in the cluster study process. So we're proposing to leave the RFP open for 367 days. That's hopefully enough time to get everybody prepped and ready to submit their bids. Bid evaluations, because this is a Oregon specific evaluation, we should be able to do it pretty quickly. We're not going to be co-optimizing against the rest of the resources across our 6 states. So we anticipate that this will be an accelerated process, as well as the regulatory approval of the final shortlist, half the time of normal. We're also proposing to, because there's still a considerable amount of resources that we're going to have to contract for this. We're looking at 500 megawatts of 20 megawatt resources. So it's a considerable number of contracts to negotiate, and we're proposing to just use a standardized contract and avoid independently negotiating each one. And then that, with that timeline, it squeezes us out a little bit more time, so we can give a little bit more than 3.5 years for construction. So with that, I will go ahead and pause and see if there's any more questions. Okay, Tag, next, please. So these are some of the areas that we are going to need some input, because with a normal utility scale RFP, there's bid fees associated with submission of a bid. Those bid fees are just intended to cover the cost of processing bids. There's going to have to be something that is done in consideration of that in the small scale RFP. We're soliciting feedback as far as that goes. The other thing is, the IE is not a requirement, but it is something that we very much recommend. We do appreciate the expertise that PA Consulting brings to the table, and they've got quite a bit of familiarity with our system, as well as all the workings of the Oregon Commission. So what that final charge cost will be, it's unknown, but that's something that certainly is an open-ended question, and we're soliciting input there, as well as, and this is a pretty significant one, so project development security in regards to winning bidders. There is going to be security that's required. There's no way to get around that. that's just something that is necessary for many reasons. But we want to make sure that we're soliciting feedback on that topic. We understand what the purpose is for House Bill 2021. We want to make sure that this is a process that is accessible as possible. But at the same time, you know, we have to do some things that are going to assure that these projects get delivered. So price scoring, normally in a utility scale RFP, we'll go ahead and develop that, do a fully co-optimized price score within the Plexos model. Once again, you know, this is our suggestion. There should be no issues with it, but you know, we can overlook things, so please let us know. But we were planning on using a Excel cost model as far as being able to rank and score all of the resources. And then as far as non-price scoring, we're going to be soliciting feedback along those lines, because that's where the equity determinations need to be taken into account, and we really need some input as far as how to, you know, weight those equity measures. So, and then last but not least, the you know, it's a strong recommendation on our part that we use a standardized contract. And then there's one last thing that I want to touch upon, because the rules were silent on co-located resources, meaning resources that are 20 megawatts in size, but they are located very next to each other. And we really need some guidance along those lines. As far as, you know, we understand what the intent of House Bill 2021 was, but we didn't say, or House Bill 2021 left the door open to those types of resources, and we're seeking feedback as far as how we should treat those.
Hey, Tom.
So, yes.
Question for you from Joshua. Is
Yes.
it the same security requirement for small scale facilities?
That is what we're seeking feedback upon, because the security that I have posted up there, that's you know, very similar to what a utility scale RFP would be. And so we don't necessarily believe that it is appropriate to have the same security for, let's say, a municipality that's delivering a project that is located within Oregon versus a, you know, professional developer that you know, is bringing a project to the table within Oregon. Those are two different things in my mind, because one of those is squarely within the intent of House Bill 2021, but not necessarily in the letter of the law. And that's where we're soliciting feedback.
Tom, one more question.
Sure.
Does the all resource RFP provide consideration on location in or proximity to Oregon?
The all source RFP is an RFP that is exclusive to the system, so all 6 states. It does not favor, weight, or discriminate based upon the state of location. Which also brings up another very interesting point, and that is House Bill 2021 does not require any of the resources to be located in Oregon. And we would also appreciate guidance on that topic. I see Hannah has a hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know if you were taking verbal questions. This is my
Sure.
Good. This is my question. Hi, I'm Hannah Cruz with Energy Trust of Oregon. And yeah, if you could just repeat. So by all source RFP, in your 6-state region, the system just needs to be connected within those 6 states. There's no consideration or weight given to those, renewable electrons that basically could be coming from Oregon and serving Oregon. They could be coming from anywhere, and there's a accounting methodology you use to book it to Oregon sales. Am I interpreting that correctly?
I think I'm not quite understanding the question, so I want to make sure that I don't like butcher it and give you misinformation. So the all source RFP is explicit to the 6-state system or system area. And so it's considering the best resources for the 6-state area. It's not, it doesn't have any consideration for location. It's there for economics. That's why we're proposing to hold a separate RFP exclusively for small scale renewables. And at that point, we can weight those. They're all attributed explicitly to Oregon, and they're going to be scored based upon, and I want to make sure I get this right. So if it's located in Oregon, we want to be sure to score it appropriately, as opposed to a resource that is located in Utah that's a small scale renewable resource. That same 20 megawatt resource would get allocated within the multi-state process to Oregon, and it would be situs to Oregon, but it wouldn't be located there. And so that's also one of the topics that we're requesting feedback on, is how are we supposed to treat resources that are bidding into the small scale renewable RFP that are not located in Oregon versus resources that are located in Oregon.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Does that,
Hey, Tom.
did that come close? Yep.
Yes, getting my head around it. Thank you.
Tom, 2 more questions. One from
Sure.
Lucas. Are you open to bids with a portfolio of projects with price being determined by how many are accepted? So in parens, it's taking advantage of economies of scale.
So I believe that, and if I'm extrapolating the question a little bit, and if you are referring to co-located resources, we are still seeking guidance on how we're supposed to treat those co-located resources. If you're talking about resources that are not co-located, we're still going to have a very difficult time taking into consideration an economy of scale, because each of these are individual bids. They're not tied together.
Lucas, feel free to come off mute if you want to provide more context or ask an additional question.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so my question is mostly, if you're developing 20 megawatt projects, then just developing one by one is going to be more expensive than, for example, trying to develop a portfolio where you can, buy a bunch of the material together, and also at the same time, maybe not have them co-located, but share certain resources together. And, do you see an advantage in maybe giving that option during the bid?
Obviously, there is an advantage to economies of scale. There's no doubt about that. And what you're posing is a very interesting question, and that is something, how, we'll have to go back internally ourselves, and we'll have to determine how we could structure something that would consider that. At that point, I think you just ended our hope to use an Excel model as opposed to Plexos, because that added complexity would necessitate that. But as far as, you know, we would have to seek input as to how, you know, Oregon wants to treat an economy of scale of individual, you know, a portfolio of 20 megawatt resources. That's not something I'd complicate. A good question.
And then Tom, another question from Elise. Would the weight of the RFP have any scoring according to serving the community that it is located in, even if it isn't in Oregon, you know, such as workforce training, you know, economic development, et cetera?
So there's elements of that all come into play as far as the development of the project from the Inflation Reduction Act. But in addition to that, and that's what I was referring to as far as seeking in, you know, feedback in regards to how do we want to weight some of the you know, non-price scoring equity factors. So for instance, if, you know, there's a training program for renewable resources associated with a certain project, you know, the House Bill 2021 completely, that's right within the intent of House Bill 2021, but it's not within the written rule of House Bill 2021. And that's the reason why we're seeking feedback as to how we should weight that. So I guess, and maybe I should stick to exactly the question that was asked. Could it? Absolutely. Will it? That's based upon the input that we receive.
Elsie said thank you. And
I'm glad I could get one definitively.
no more questions at this time, Tom.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
So we'd like to open up for public comment at this point in time. Are there any general comments, anything else you'd like to express, questions you'd like answered? We would love to hear from you. And feel free to chat as well. Elsie said, thank you for hosting this workshop. So Elsie, thank you for your kind comment. Tag next slide. And Stephanie, we'd love to have you.
Hold on, we got a hand up. JP has his hand up.
Oh, hey, JP.
Sorry, I joined a bit late. I apologize. If this is already covered, we can take it offline. Or I'm just wondering how specific, of course, the relationship between the what we're just discussing, the SSRs and CBRE projects, and kind of meeting that portion of the CEP. If you guys discussed it, I apologize. I'm joining really late. I'm curious about that. It was the SSRs are a big part of the IRP CEP, and then obviously that builds on that for the CEP in Oregon. So I'm just kind of curious about that.
I can certainly start with that, Lisa, if it helps, and we might need Tom, to weigh in on his part too here. John Rush here. I did the CBRE portion of the presentation to spend time thinking about that. It's a great question. It's not a one-for-one, and there's not a clear and defined relationship between CBREs and the small-scale renewable. So from that standpoint, stepping back to the rules and the regulations and the legislation, there is a mandate that small scale renewable has a 10% target. It has a mandated target that has to be hit. And that's Tom spent a fair bit of time talking through what the size of that looks like. There are specific requirements for it to qualify to be a small scale renewable, be qualified in that bucket. And the specific pieces around that are that the projects need to actually get registered with Regis, which is a tracking network and tracking framework for tracking renewable energy credits that come out of projects. That in itself is actually a pretty substantial hurdle or step that has to be taken on by a developer to be willing to develop a project and go to that length. So those are some of just the nuances of the difference between what might be a CBRE and what becomes a small scale renewable in the end. On CBREs, there's a pretty loose definition there that is really community centric, and it's going to depend on kind of what we see from the communities themselves. There is not a target against CBREs. We don't have a target that we have to have 10% of our total or 1% of our total from CBREs specifically. So it's a little bit less, it's less mandated. And so CBREs have a lot more room to move. And we, as Pacific Power and kind of the CBRE team, will be curious to see what we see in terms of feedback and input on CBRE opportunities that we see coming forward. We would love to find the opportunities where they can match, where we can have CBREs opportunities also qualify to meet part of that small scale renewable need, but we're not prejudging anything or working through that. So I know that's a bit of a squishy answer to your question. Did that help?
Yeah, thank you very much. I know I was as I was reading the CEP and IRP, I was just curious about that.
It's a really good question. It's been we've scratched our head about it a fair bit too, frankly, in terms of how do we see these two. And I guess the short answer is too that this engagement process and the evolution of this, as we start seeing things coming back on the RFP side, things that we're getting from the community in terms of opportunities we see from the communities about CBREs, will help us kind of better understand what that Venn diagram, where these overlap, what that's going to look like. But in the best of all possible worlds, we have CBREs that really do help us toward meeting the small scale renewable goal, because then that's one resource that meets two needs, and it's always better. Right. Hope that helps. Yeah. And Tom, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Micah has a statement and a question as well. I wonder, Micah, do you mind coming off mute and maybe talking to it?
Yeah, sure. That's not a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. So talking about the broader goals of PacifiCorp, there's about a 2,500 mile energy gateway transmission expansion plan, which has an expected cost of $11 billion. And the purpose of the plan is essentially what you've been talking about in order to facilitate the renewable transition. What I'm wondering is, are the costs of this transmission infrastructure accounted for as part of the costs of renewable energy going forward, or are they accounted for separately?
Yeah, who would be the best person to respond to this question?
I believe.
Rick, please jump in.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Great, wonderful. So it's kind of a yes and yes. It's a both sort of thing. So the gateway transmission projects certainly help facilitate connectivity across PacifiCorp's broad footprint, providing access to, as Joelle commented on in her opening remarks, right, a lot of load diversity, geographic diversity, which translates into, different types of renewables that, whether it's solar or wind located in different locations that are not necessarily correlated, which is a good thing in terms of diversity with regard to their output. And so the transmission helps enable and facilitate the expansion of a diverse set of low or non-emitting resources across the footprint, and to do that on a more cost-effective basis. But it's not to say that an individual project gets assigned the specific cost of the transmission. It's handled in our planning collectively, recognizing that you can't necessarily add the resources per se without additional infrastructure investment in things like gateway or other large-scale transmission infrastructure. So it's kind of a triggering thing, in our plans. It's when we see the need for a certain amount of growth, it tends to trigger the online dates or the actual implementation of the gateway plan to begin construction of those facilities to accommodate that combination of geographically diverse resources and transmission. Hopefully that helps at least partly address your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any estimate of I guess what percentage of these products are there to facilitate the renewable transition?
If I could ask a clarifying percentage of what? Percentage of what am I? What's my numerator and denominator, I guess, in my percentage?
Right. I guess the numerator would be the number of miles of projects that are there largely or in large part to connect new renewable facilities to the grid, and the denominator would just be the total roughly 2,500 miles of the Energy Gateway expansion plan.
Yeah, so it's a very difficult metric. I don't have something specific to that, and the mileage is probably not a good explicit measure. For instance, right now we have already built segments of Gateway. Our Energy Gateway subsegment D2 was built and energized several years ago now, and that's in eastern Wyoming. Currently under construction are 2 additional subsegments of the Gateway project again in eastern Wyoming, but also connecting the Aola substation in eastern Wyoming into Mona in central Utah, and then initiating construction yet this year. Our plans for Boardman to Hemingway, which is also an element of the Gateway project, will provide connectivity from essentially the RMP or the Rocky Mountain power side of our system over to the west side of our system. And broadly, that infrastructure can do a number of things to facilitate the needed growth of new renewable energy on the system. One, an important piece, and they're separate and distinct elements that are critical. They can improve interconnection capability, so just the ability to plug in new resources, not even accounting for the flow of power on the system once a resource is plugged in. So those projects facilitate that capability, and in different locations. The Gateway South projects, the things under construction now, add interconnection capability for new resources in Wyoming by way of example. And they also facilitate interconnection of projects in Utah along the same lines. Boardman to Hemingway facilitates growing interconnection capability in Idaho, as an example. And then once those projects are plugged in, the infrastructure itself provides the ability to move energy across the system, to move energy from our resources to the load areas where it may be needed and when it may be needed, regardless of and that can accommodate flows for all kinds of resource technologies that might plug into the system for a long period of time. Right, over the transmission assets can have a life of 60 plus or more years. So kind of having that backbone infrastructure not only facilitates the near-term growth in renewables and clean energy, but provides that long-term infrastructure as those assets hit the end of their lives, to be in place to still accommodate that diversity and grow, beyond technologies we may not even be able to think of can still use that transmission right long into the future. So it's the mileage isn't as important as it getting access to the different types of resources, the uncorrelated output from variable energy resources, and the geographic diversity, even from a load point of view, where we can move that clean energy to parts of our system when we need it, at the right points in time. And that also speaks to reliability. So I don't have an exact metric, and it's not the way we think of it. It's more of that broader context of, kind of having the superhighway that allows power to flow from different locations to different load centers, that's dynamic and can accommodate shifts, in the system as they occur in real time.
Thank you.
Any other comment or questions?
There's
Hi,
a hand up. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Joshua.
Joshua Bassett, Solution. Sort of a caveat to this question is I'm not super well versed in the RFP process, but it seems like there's some fairly significant costs that have to be borne by the sort of the developers of small scale resources. So you have the bidding costs, you have the security that's required, and I believe the interconnection costs have to be borne by the project proponents. And I'm just wondering, this may be kind of a question and a comment. Are there things that Pacific Power can do to help foster the kind of broader ecosystem of small scale renewable projects? You've said that you've found that there are not as many projects bidding into the RFP as you would like. So, maybe there are things that you can do, like helping connect small scale project proponents to grants, or, providing technical support or technical resources. Are there some of those things that the Pacific Power can do to kind of help move that pipeline along, and, recognize that, it's kind of difficult to get these projects off the ground?
Hello, hold on just a second. I've got some feedback. So we're going to have to go back and take a look at that and see exactly what we can do. And you're hitting upon a lot of the things that are challenges, but addressing those challenges are a considerable problem. It's that's the big challenge, and I don't know that Pacific Corp can just be able to provide that. I don't know that we're necessarily the right ones to do that either in all situations, because I think some of these can end up to be highly nuanced. But we can certainly take a look and see how we can, potentially help out.
Hey, Tom, this is Rick. I can't help now that I've spoken, maybe offer just some thoughts on the topic. Certainly not a position per se, and we've had some of that conversation, frankly, ourselves around, how do we go about encouraging and ensuring we hit the compliance target, frankly, And I think in the construct of trying to provide technical support, one of the hurdles, at least that I see in that pathway, is if you just consider the size of the task in front of us. Tom hit on the numbers. I think it was over 400 megawatts by 2030, and then up to really over 800 megawatts as we move beyond 2030. Each 20 megawatts or less, and if you do the simple math and assume, call it the 800 megawatt zone, and 20 megawatts, everything comes in at the max capacity. That qualifies as small scale. That's 40 different projects. That is an entire consulting business alone to help provide technical support for 40 different small scale projects. And that's, remember, the smallest end. If projects come in at 10 megawatts, it's 80 projects that might require some of that support. So I certainly understand the question and its intent, but there are challenges in at least from my lens of trying to figure out, what can we do that's equitable across projects. If we're going to provide some form of service, for lack of another better word, do we want to do that across the board and not single out specific projects? That's an entirely new department, most likely, and a pretty significant exercise of getting the right expertise to do that at a pretty tremendous scale pretty quickly. So just food for thought, in terms of thinking through what the requirements of that might ultimately translate to, and how fast that would have to ramp up.
And Rose, you have your hand up?
Yes. Hi. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I
can.
haven't been here for this whole call, so I hope my question is something we haven't already covered. Just wanting to ask about potential other ways to help with the small scale RFP. And I guess, have we definitively determined that it must be equal amount of support provided to 40 different projects, or could there be certain projects that are kind of selected as a supplement to the RFP? Maybe the RFP brings in a certain number and then the company provides support for extras. That could be one way to not need to build a new department. And the other question that I had was, have you thought about Pacificor having bids in that RFP, like benchmark bids?
So
go
ahead, Rick.
Go ahead, Tom. Okay. So all great questions, Rose. I think fundamentally, in terms of, again, I was just trying to give some food for thought. If there's thoughts and ideas, we're open to those ways to try to, provide some level of support for small scale projects. We have an incentive to do so. We have a compliance obligation we certainly intend to meet. And so we're open to those comments. These are just thoughts that we've been kicking around. And then in terms of, kind of thinking through the concept of benchmarks, I'd say we're not entirely, committed one way or the other at this stage. And it kind of boils down to somewhat of a similar issue. I mean, just on a system procurement basis, in addition to the small scale requirements, in that world, we are also, having a pretty heavy lift. Tom walked through those numbers early in his presentation as well, with 12 to 15 gigawatts, right, of new resource procurement, most likely utility scale, due to cost effectiveness over the course of the next 8 to 10 years. And that same team of folks who would probably be best positioned with their expertise and their experience to support small scale will also be the same team of folks that need to help us and support our efforts for the larger scale procurement as well. And whether a project's 20 megawatts or 100 megawatts, in terms of people power, getting permits, working through interconnection, negotiating contract terms, those sorts of things. It's not like it takes half the people, to do a 20 megawatt project as it does 100. And so, it still comes down to, it's at some point in some level, where are the priorities and where should we focus and where can we rely on, call it the marketplace, to help support us. And I don't think we're entirely, solved that or have the solution that we would propose to that yet, but those are things we're considering, Rose.
Thanks.
Just for Rick or Tom, just kind of building on that response. And Rick, thanks for the response. It's great. And building on Rose's question, is there, you guys, I didn't see it in the CEP, but did you guys go back and look at Oregon cluster studies for projects that were 20 megawatts or less? And in terms of, again, building on Rose's question around, I don't know, support, but like those projects and those associated costs for those projects that were in the cluster study. I mean, I'll be honest, the last one I looked at, I think was like 2022 or 2021. So I don't know where you guys are at with that, but as far as low-hanging fruit and projects that meet the SSR.
So Rick, I can take that one.
Yep.
So in the very recent past, like towards the end of June, I made an inquiry as to how many submissions we had into the current cluster study. And so all submissions into, the cluster study process in Oregon, and this was limited to just Oregon. I didn't check for small scale renewables anywhere across the rest of the 6-state area. But we had just slightly less than the required amount for us to be able to hit compliance. So those were not projects, those are just cluster study submissions, and that is, no indication that that is projects that are going to be developed. So, but at least there is capacity out there that gets us, closer to the goalpost.
Based on, yeah, that's helpful. I know from the cluster studies there were,
yeah, and I think look at it.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, there's two different areas here. So there's, the 400 megawatts of, and I'm rounding the numbers, but by 2030, a little over 400 megawatts, the number gets much larger, right? You move just slightly beyond that window. And I think the short of it is, my interpretation of kind of looking at that data is it's pretty insufficient in terms of hitting those requirements. And so hence, Tom's focus on, recognizing these upcoming cluster studies and the need to get, more engagement from small scale projects into the cluster study process, sooner rather than later, because it's not uncommon, for a cluster study process as it moves forward to, get an initial result for a cluster. And I think as those that are somewhat familiar with that process, and depending on the level of interest and demand in a given cluster, some of those entities may choose to drop out of the process. And when that happens, then there's a restudy, right? And that gives you a different answer for the remaining participants that are now in a smaller group in a particular cluster. And that process can actually repeat a number of times for restudy work until you kind of get to a point where projects are deemed or either deciding to move forward with interconnection or not. And so my only point in highlighting that is that can take time that we have to account for when we're sitting here in the the summer of 2023. In a lot of ways, 2030 seems like a far way out, but when you imagine participation starting next year that could easily go into 2025 window or beyond for cluster study results. That window to get from interconnection to commercial operation before the end of 2030 starts to get pretty narrow. And so we do see in general a pretty significant need to boost the interest in engagement and participation of small scale projects here in the near term to hit those 2030 targets, which get even more onerous. I wouldn't say onerous, but they climb considerably beyond 2030 as we look out to that planning process. So that's, I think, maybe a bit more context for you to take away.
That's great. Yeah, and I looked at the 2020. Looked at the 2021 cluster study, so it's old. I know it's not probably the same projects, but there's just thinking there's some projects there that have interconnection or station equipment costs or network upgrade costs that aren't terribly onerous given the size. They're up close to that 20, and I was just thinking, how might that, as you do more cluster studies, how might advancing the completion of those projects, facility, equipment, network upgrades help you move faster? That's it.
Any other comments or questions? Can we go on to the next slides, Tag and Stephanie? Thank you for coming on and helping us with next steps.
Yes. Now, as we conclude our third session of the 5 planned sessions for 2023 in this series, let's recap and look forward. First, in the beginning, we had the February session, which was an introduction on House Bill 2021 and clean energy plans. In April, we previewed our clean energy plan prior to filing, which we filed our clean energy plan May 31st. And now we have discussed our filed clean energy plan with focus on elements of our action plan, specifically on resilience, community-based renewable energy, and resource procurement. Each of these presentations, as well as our clean energy plan, are available or will be available for this one on our Oregon Clean Energy Plan webpage. As a reminder, these presentations are recorded and the recordings are also available at the same page. If you reflect on this presentation and find that you have more feedback to provide to us, we ask that you share that with us by sending an email to OregonCEP@pacificcorp.com. We continue to present our clean energy plan in different spaces, including our Community Benefit Indicators Advisory Group, or CBIAG. I also want to point out there is a special meeting on Tuesday before the Oregon Public Utility Commission, or OPUC, where we present our clean energy plan, our integrated resource plan, to the commissioners. You will find a link to that meeting on OPUC's website. As you have heard from us today, we see our clean energy plan as evolving with our engagements in our communities, with stakeholders, OPUC, and staff. We will come back in August to present an update on the progress forward of our clean energy plan to getting to our 100% clean energy. We appreciate you spending your time with us to share more details on our clean energy plan, and we look forward to more interactions and discussions on our clean energy plan in the future. Thank you for your time today. We do truly appreciate it and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.